Hello and welcome to Film Theory's lecture series. Today I'm going to start to talk about film language, film narrative, which is chapter 2 in your textbook. First, however, let me just clarify how I plan to use these materials that you have at your disposal. First of all, like I said in my introductory video, you have these short videos in which I try to explain the most essential terminology that you need to know, highlight some of the context pertaining to the topic at hand, and then you are invited to go back to the book, the text, read the text, obviously try to understand what I'm talking about there, and then you will have the prezzies as well at your disposal, so you can play the prezzi, you can check out the extra material that I included there, and then go on to the end of the chapter in the book. You will find a list of keywords. These are really important, and basically I base my lecture series on the keywords. So if you go through the keywords and try to understand, try to define them, I think you will be safe for the exam. Don't worry about that. But if you have a question or questions, please feel free to ask them in the CoSpace forum. You just hit new forum entry and ask the question. I will be there, obviously, and I think you can ask any questions because many of you may have the very same question. If I fail to clarify something, if you don't understand something in the text, or if you don't find the relevant information in the prezzi, just ask it away and I'll try to answer them, these questions. Okay, so today I'm going to start to talk about film language, like I said, and the number one question is, of course, whether film is a language at all. How can we talk about film as an analogy to language, which is a very problematic topic. This chapter has two large parts, but I will do 3 short videos and I explain why. First, I'm going to talk about the narrative aspect, because narrative will be the bridge between literature and film, or literary theory and film theory. And adaptation is another huge topic you will see. So I will try to dissect the videos into 3, because the narrative aspect will have 2 distinctive train of thoughts, and I would like to go back to both of them and clarify many of the misunderstandings or problematic issues with them. And then I move on in the third video, I move on to talk about adaptation. So that's going to be a separate part, but you will see that chapter-wise, it's one chapter. Okay, so let's start with narrative. Okay, to study film narratives, we usually rely on 2 separate theoretical trends, separate and yet they are usually combined when practiced. One of them is semiotics, which is the study of sign, as you might know, and the other is narratology, that is the study of narratives. Now, obviously, both of these tendencies in critical thinking, they come primarily from literary studies, so we'll have to somehow tweak them to make them easy to use for filmic analysis as well. The reason for relying on these aspects is because talking about the academia and the theoretical occupation with films, you need to understand that it's basically, at the beginning, it's basically literary scholars who try to understand the working of film as a narrative. That's why we usually talk about narrative cinema and not others. I mean, that's the mainstream in film theory as well. So it's the formalist, the structuralist, and the post-structuralist trends in literary theory and in critical studies that heavily influenced film theory and film analysis. One of the pivotal questions here, though, is how do we, spectators, consumers, how do we make sense of narratives? How do narratives communicate and sell us stories and tell us stories? Well, we learn from literature, this obviously is not new to you, I hope so. There is a speaker who relates a story to a listener. There's an addressee in the story. Now, this speaker is called the narrator. This function in the narratives secures the engagement of the spectator, as we can immediately relate to somebody who is conveying a story which might be of interest to us already. And it's very easy to follow somebody who's speaking to us, and we can see how the fictional world unfolds based on the narrator's idea and how the narrator builds up the whole world and the whole story. Now, the very term narrator is really telling. It comes from literature, as I said earlier, where it has a linguistic function. The narrator is the enunciator. He or she is the one who speaks. Hence the connection, even in film studies, with the literary definitions of the narrator. And that's why we use a linguistic analogy in tackling the issues surrounding narration and the function of the narrator. That is, first and foremost, we define the function of the narrator in literature, in literary terms, and of course, as a position taken in language. Now, when it comes to film, the position and the functioning of the narrator can get really, really tricky. Sometimes you hear somebody speaking, talking to you or talking to someone. Sometimes you don't have anyone there to guide you through the newly built universe. So based on the different basic types, we have two large differentiations to make when we talk about narration in film. And it concerns the diegetic realm, that is a narrative that is built up and is unfolding in front of you. One narrator is within the diegetic realm, within the diegesis, and we call this type of narrator intra-diegetic, intra meaning inside. The other type of the narrator who does not appear in the diegetic realm at all, there's no trace, there's no voiceover, there's nothing. We still have narration going on, right? So that type of narrator is called extra-diegetic narrator. Now, with extra-diegetic narrators, we don't really have anything to do here because we cannot really put our fingers on that function. We know there's a narration, there is a kind of overall design to the narrative, but there is no one character or voice that we can pinpoint the source to. However, with intradiegetic, the interesting thing is that we have two types, two options to work with. One is we call homodiegetic narrator, and the other is heterodiegetic narrator. Now, homo means the same, hetero means the different. So homodiegetic is usually a character narrator, that is, he or she appears in the story, in the film, but he or she also appears in his or her own narration, his or her own story. That's why it's homodiegetic. That is, this narrator functions as a character and actively participates in the story that unfolds. However, we have a heterodiegetic narrator as well. Now here we have this function is basically a narrator who relates a story, tells you the story. He or she can be identified as the source of the story. However, he or she does not participate in the story that he or she is telling us. So basically what we see here is a differentiation in the level of subjectivity and objectivity. We tend to believe that the extra-diegetic narrator is kind of an omniscient narrator, the third-person narrator in literary studies, and we associate a godlike perspective to this kind of narrator. That is, he or she knows everything, he or she does not meddle with the rest of the diegetic realm, and therefore we think that he or she is more objective regarding the plot, regarding the diegetic realm. Whereas with intradiegetic narrators, we have a very strong level of subjectivity. With heterodiegetic, we have within this strong subjectivity, we have less, obviously, because the one who speaks does not take part within the story. So there is a distanciation from the narrative that he or she tells us. With the homodiegetic narrator, however, this narrator is involved in the very narrative that he or she is talking about. So that's why we think that there's a very strong level of subjectivity going on there. But this is not enough. Film is not literature. Film is not merely text. It's not really just the story. We have several other tracks and parts of film which help narration going on. Therefore, we need to think about the visual facet of narration as well, which is obviously the most predominant aspect of film even today. So again, we need to turn to literature, but we need to redefine somehow how we think about this idea, this other part of the narration, the visual part of narration. And here we introduce another term, the vocalizer. The act of vocalization in film studies is basically a counterpart to the act of narration. Whereas the narrator is the one who speaks, the vocalizer is the one who sees. In Hollywood narration, usually you have a character, a central character, whose vision is followed throughout the film. It's not only the story, it's not only his or her presence within that story as a main character, but also his or her vision is translated into the narration process of the film. You can spot these when if Brad Pitt looks to the left, then the next cut will show what he's looking at, and then the cut comes back to the face of Brad Pitt. So you associate the object of vision with the vision of Brad Pitt's. That's how it works. And basically that's the simplest act of vocalization. That's how it works. Now, these two should work together to formulate a coherent and comprehensible narrative world, which we call diegesis. Now, what is diegesis? It comes from the old Greeks, of course, namely Aristotle. If you read the Poetics, you will see a distinction in the building up of narratives according to Aristotle, who talks about a diegetic narrative on the one hand and a mimetic narrative on the other. Now, with the diegetic narrative, Aristotle tells us that there is a poet who speaks to us. Whereas with the mimetic tradition, we do not have a poet, but rather the whole story is acted out, is played. So it's very easy to spot the difference between the what we might call the performative or dramatic tradition versus the narrative tradition. In film studies, we say that the diegesis is basically the entire narrative world unfolding on the screen in front of us. That is, everything is included: the plot, the mise en scène, the visual materials included, the characters, the outfit of the characters, the editing or montage. Everything together is basically this narrative world, this diegetic realm. Now, it is an interesting question. How does this narrative world appear in front of us, and how do we make sense of it? Why does it work, to simplify? For the formalists, the question, of course, goes back to how they studied literature. They studied the formal qualities here in terms of the narrator. They realized that there might be a significant difference between how a film is presented or shown and how we can retell the story of that narrative. So the way a narrative appears, they found a term, it's going to be a nice term, Sujay. The English translation usually is the plot. Basically, the plot is everything that you get on the screen, the way you get it on the screen. What you see is what you get. That's basically the plot, or Sujay, according to formalist lingo. Now, you might have jumps in time, you might have jumps in points of view, so everything which appears, and as it appears in the film, that's part of the sujet. It's the making of the filmmakers. This is how the narrator presents the world to you, and that's what you get. That's it. However, if you go home and somebody asks you to tell something about the movie that you've just seen, then probably chances are that you will not go through the plot events, that is the chronology of the plot, but rather you will restructure everything according to how you understood that film. You rework the plot entities into a kind of a new film, basically a new narrative, your own narrative, in other words, your own interpretation. And according to formalists, this mental reworking of the plot or sujet is called fabula, or story. So as opposed to the sujet or the plot, which is basically that's what you get on the screen, the fabula exists only in your head, and that's basically a linear, chronological, straightened out narrative or comprehension of what you got as the film. Let me give you an example. The film Magnolia, which is structured in a very difficult way. It's really sophisticated in its narrative structure. It has many storylines, loads of characters, and to some viewers it's pretty difficult to follow sometimes. So what the filmmakers did at the beginning of the film, they gave you the recipe, how to read, how to comprehend Magnolia, the film. And basically they included 3 short clips which have nothing to do whatsoever with the plot or the story of the film, but teach you the method of reading the film, which is really interesting and intriguing way of introducing spectators to a specific diegetic realm. I will give you a small exercise. I will explain the first short clip, and then at home, if you open the Prezi, you will have the shortened version, the cut version of these scenes. You can practice the same. Basically, what I'm going to do is give you the narrative frames, identify the narrator, and give you the recipe of how to read these short narratives, which you might use if you are interested in your reading of the film Magnolia, which I really strongly suggest you watch. Now you have plenty of time, so just, make use of it.
In the New York Herald, November 26, year 1911, there is an account of the hanging of 3 men. They died for the murder of Sir Edmund William Godfrey, husband, father, pharmacist, and all-around gentleman resident of Greenberry Hill, London. He was murdered by 3 vagrants whose motive was simple robbery. They were identified as Joseph Green, Stanley Berry, and Daniel Hill. Green, Berry, Hill. And I would like to think this was only a matter of chance.
Okay, so first thing, all of the stories will be kind of Darwin Award winners, so expect that. But also what is interesting is that even in this short clip, even in this, 2 minutes, you have a complication of a chronological linear story. So much so that basically you are intrigued. What you see is that it's basically the end of the story that you are presented with, and you hear the voice of a narrator. So right at the first moment, what you need to do is identify the source of utterance, the enunciator, the one who speaks. Here, it's conveniently a narrative voice, a male narrative voice. So we have the narrator's voice as the outer frame of the narrative. Then he remembers that the story was published in a newspaper. So the newspaper is already a narrative frame into the diegetic realm. Then we see the hanging of the three men, another level, of course. Then we learn about the murder, which did not start out as a murder, but it became a kind of a homicide. And then we are introduced to these three vagrants. We learn their names, Green, Berry, and Hill. And then we learn about the pharmacist and his family, who live where? Well, in London, Greenberry Hill. So basically, if you go the other way around, that is, you start from this, from the gist of the story, we have a family, we have a pharmacist who is well regarded and you know, well, a well-established pharmacist who has a nice family, they're happy, and then one day three vagrants want to rob him and accidentally they kill him, and then they are taken into custody and they are hanged. And then there's a narrator who reads the newspapers and tells us about this. So this is how the whole chronology works out from the plot, where the events, the separate parts of the story are mixed up to make it more interesting. Now go to the Prezi or download the film, watch the film, watch these first 3 clips and practice. I promise you that the next 2 clips, they will get very, very complicated, although they are pretty short. So good luck and see you next time.